Hey buddy, how are you? What are we discussing today?
We're discussing a few things. The whole episode or the whole video was inspired by a Stack News article that came out this night, I think, or maybe this morning, I don't know. And I shared it because I've seen it in my timeline and it's gotten a good response and it's an interesting topic, so we recorded a video.
Yeah, and I saw your tweet this morning when I woke up. You must be an early riser, Joël. Bloody hell, I saw this tweet and I was like, okay. And then I started reading it. I was late for work because of this. But it was a good read.
You want the full honesty. I tweeted it when I was sitting on the loo. It's my morning read.
Mate, your routine is your routine. I'm happy for you.
101 for a semi-viral tweet. Step number 1, sit on the toilet.
It's better than scrolling through TikTok, I suppose, isn't it?
I don't have TikTok on my phone, so I can't tell you.
Mate, I was reading this article, and I've got to say, the last paragraph I agree with, and we can work backwards, I suppose. And it says, if we want Bitcoin to be a reality 10, 20, or 40 years from now, we need to be a hell of a lot more critical today. Critical of the developers and the companies that build products. Critical of the influencers who go from conference to conference, and much more critical of the realistic with ourselves. The war is not yet won. I understand and I agree with that, and it's something I always say, you know, we need to be critical, we need to have those discussions, we need to have those debates, because that's the only way that we can drive this movement forward, really, and sort of end up somewhere where we, as a society, as a race, can sort of thrive and do what's best for us in the long term, right? But there are some things in the article where I'm like, yeah, I'm on the fence about that, or I question whether they fully understand Bitcoin. But we can go through that later on in the episode. But what was your initial thoughts when you first read it? Because you're the one who put the tweet out this morning. Go on, what do you think?
It fit nicely with some of the stuff I've been thinking outside of Bitcoin, because you and we talked about this in a private conversation on Telegram. And we sort of went, well, Bitcoin does take up a lot of our time, for me especially, as I do have some clients in it as well. But there's a life outside of Bitcoin. And that was sort of my first initial, response, feeling, I would say, when I read it. I was like, oh yeah, there's actually a lot of good stuff in there. I'm on your end as well. There are some things where I go, is it really like the author is saying it is? And if you read the replies on Stack News, we'll link the article below, you'll see that a lot of people, I think, share similar questions. But overall, I would say, yeah, I had about the same questions beforehand. The only thing that I had is like, I don't know if this person, I think he's not American. He mentioned it somewhere that he lives in Spain or something.
Yeah, I'm reading in between the lines, because if they've done an English version and immediately after the Spanish version. So I think reading the article in English, it's clear that, you know, maybe English is their second language, but it does read very well. It is well written. So I think, you know, there must be native in terms of being Spanish speaking. Otherwise, I'm just assuming here they would, you know, just write the article in Spanish, but they've really made an effort to sort of spread the message across as many people as possible.
I mean, to me, the only issue I'm having, and this is really a very minor thing, because again, I think this depends heavily how you've been brought up and all of these things. It does have the typical hardcore libertarian touch, and I know
it does.
I could offend a lot of people saying this, because I know there are a lot of libertarians, but what I want to say is, a lot of it is, you know, you have to drive in hardcore, don't show wallet of Satoshi to shop owners, start with like immediately self-custodying. And I know that this is the end goal, but when I read it initially, I was like, okay, these are the points where I disagree ever so slightly, because if I do orange pill a coffee shop, for example, it is easier getting started this way. And it's not like I'm there once and I never show up again. I'll be returning day in, day out. So those are the sort of the little subtleties I had in it. There were also the whole thing making it about war. Like, I get the analogy, but everything has to be war these days. So I'm like, fuck it, could use another word. But I get why he chose that word, because he was able to portray it quite nicely. But yeah, like I said, that was the only negative in quotation mark thing I read, because there was a lot of realism in it, and a lot of stuff I think a lot of Bitcoiners think in private but are not able to say
what
out
comes
loud.
across from the article is, you know, the genuine concern that this person has. And you know, relatively early on I'm relatively early on in my Bitcoin journey still. And, you know, despite that, I still go through phases of like, not doubt, but like, describe it like, I question my own reality sometimes. I'm like, shit, is this, you know, am I in the echo chamber? I self-check myself. Am I in the echo chamber? Have I misunderstood something? Let me just double check it. And I go through like these regular sort of internal review processes about my idea of what I understand Bitcoin to be.
Yes.
You know, sometimes I've sort of mistakenly understood something and it's not that, and I've had to rethink it and double check again. So I think every Bitcoiner really who's invested in it emotionally and mentally goes through these natural phases, and this person who just put that concern down on paper or on the internet for us to read. And I think it's important that people do this, you know, and come up with their own sort of ideas and share it amongst all the rest of the Bitcoin community, the Bitcoin ecosystem, because this is all part of Bitcoin, really, in my mind. It's like, you know, put something out there and see where it lands and see what feedback you get. You're going to get plenty of go fuck yourselves. You're going to get plenty of people giving their own opinion, plenty of people agreeing with you. And over time, people will come to a more general understanding and sort of, you know, a common understanding of what it is. And this can only be achieved by articles like this, and people, you know, effectively wear their hearts on their sleeve and just put something out there, and effectively are vulnerable about their doubts, and open to be criticised and have critical discussion. So I commend this person for doing it. It's quite clear, obviously, because in the first sentence it says that this person is they're saying that they're a libertarian and an anarchist, and they've been so for like 2 decades. So really, that just sets the tone for me straight away that this person is, you know, an anarchist, libertarian, and maybe I'm guessing here that not enough is happening for them to feel satisfied about what it is that they want to achieve in the Bitcoin space, and that is some anarchism, some libertarian freedom. And it's taken a long time. Bitcoin is 14 years old now. You know, and if they've been in the Bitcoin space for a long time, things aren't really progressing at speed. And sometimes I go through phases like, fucking hell, this is going to take a long time, probably not in my lifetime, and all this sort of stuff. And it is just going to be TikTok next block. It's going to happen when it happens, and it's just going to be an organic process, and we just have to just allow that process to play out, I think. And there's only so much we can do, so much we can say, and in doing so, in saying stuff, and you know, our podcast, you know, some people might be listening to it and taking something from it, and applying that to their understanding of their Bitcoin. You know, it's just, you know, the freedom of information that's flowing on the internet, and you know, some of it's going to stick, some of it isn't.
Yeah, totally. And I also had some, should I call it, I wouldn't say doubt. Well, there were doubts. I mean, if you scroll through Bitcoin Twitter, Bitcoin Noster, it's the part where he's going quite early here in the middle, where he says, we like to think that 99%, oh no, it's actually earlier, sorry. It's amazing to see how when a venture capitalist says something bad about Bitcoin, is that he's scamming people, but when he says something wild along the lines of BTC will be worth 1 million in 3 months, we'll start rolling over the scammer. This is obviously to the other guy calling for Bitcoin a million in 90 days.
Who was that?
I forget his name, or is it Barzachil, the guy calling it a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I heard it, but I just immediately disregarded it as like nonsense.
Yeah. I guess for a lot of us, it is sort of this thing, which then he goes on in the next paragraph, where he goes, we like to think that 99% of humanity is absolutely moronic, but as Bitcoiners who have seen the light, I quite like that analogy, we are better than the rest. We don't realize that we are people too. When someone says Ethereum to the moon, we think they're a scammer or an asshole. But if they say the same thing about Bitcoin, what does he know that I don't? That's sort of the reaction we get. And, honestly, when I heard that 1 million bet in 90 days thing, I was like, yeah, this is just another one of those venture capitalists. Good for him if he realizes it. If not, the world is going to continue to turn. Bitcoin will produce new blocks. So there's not much that we can do about it, but it's obviously a narrative which you can start pushing. And sort of with my background, whenever people start pushing these narratives, this is where the same thing happens, like you said, the doubt keeps creeping in, and where I go, well, is it really that, or will there be more to the story? Yeah, and I guess, especially if he's been in the libertarian anarchist world for the past 20 years, and he says he's been in Bitcoin space for a few years, let's say he's been in it for 5 years. For 15 years, he probably didn't really see a tool to fulfill his libertarian anarchist ideas, I imagine. You could make the point there were some trial phases in there. But probably when he got Bitcoin, he got overly excited. And I think it's what you said. It's just such a long time horizon that you sometimes feel a bit bummed out. And on the other hand, he then goes into a bit of a rant saying that, I keep hearing Bitcoin is inevitable. I'm sorry, but it's not. He compares it to email. Yeah, this is where
these are the things I'm like,
It's a tough thing to compare, because the world has been a different state when email came about. I mean, the internet didn't exist back then. Email sort of crept this way in, and this is why I sometimes love the comparison with Bitcoin and the internet, and then at times I hate it, because there were different times in our society when both inventions came in. So this is also the part where I go a bit, I get his point, but he goes about NFTs a bit, and he's a bit bummed out that all of these pictures are on the chain. Again, I don't have issue if people like this stuff. If that's fulfillment to them, great. I'm not really a big fan. If we could fill the block with transactions of people in third world countries instead of a funny image, I'd say that has more of an importance. But people do what they're going to do, so you can't change that. Bitcoin doesn't change this thing.
I think a lot of progress comes from trial and error and making mistakes and experimenting. And Bitcoin allows us to do that, to experiment, to try our luck and to see if it gets rejected. And that's the whole idea of it, right? That's where, in my mind, the idea of abundance comes from, because someone might come up with something new and imaginative and unheard of, and everyone might get behind it, and then it will become part of popular culture and ideas, right? This is how new ideas are born, is by people trying their luck, or they've come up with an idea. And like it says here, that we like to think that 99% of humanity is absolutely moronic. I don't quite agree with that, really. I think everyone's got the capacity within them to understand, if we're talking about Bitcoin here, understand Bitcoin. And I think over time people will start, as this technology evolves and becomes more accessible, because at the moment it's not hugely accessible to everybody. It's a little bit technical. It takes a long time to understand, to get your head around. And this whole thing about, getting people off of like this custodial wallets and onto nodes, it's just too much too soon, For it's enough to just get your head around what the concept is, let alone then trying to set up a node and stuff. It's just, it's a grassroots movement. You have to do your own research. You have to do your own proof of work in a way, and then decide independently as a sovereign individual whether to take the next step or not. And and as more people adopt Bitcoin, there will be more nodes, there will be more non-custodial wallets, and people taking their Bitcoin off of exchanges over time. It's just not happening the way that this person has imagined it to be, and as quick as they imagine it to be. And so that's probably on that person's own timeline, right? And that's why they're, I think, frustrated and why they're writing this article in the first place. But I think, Bitcoin is inevitable. I think, I was listening to one of, always have difficulty pronouncing his name, Antonopoulos.
Antonopoulos, yeah.
And yeah, that guy. I was listening to one of his lessons on YouTube the other day, and he was talking about how the blockchain works and things like that. And, you're talking about ordinals and this and that and the other. And I think I'm trying to, I'm trying to form a picture in my head about how Bitcoin is inevitable, because he was talking about how the blockchain works. And when a miner creates a block, there may be two competing blocks, and then the one block will be the one that wins, and the other one just basically disappears as if it never happened in the first place, because it's commonly agreed that this block is the one that's going to be part of the blockchain. So in a way, I think the Bitcoin ecosystem, the users on it, will be sort of replicating that in some way, because, new ideas are going to come up, and we're going to sort of, seeing how Bitcoin evolves over time. And we're the ones that are going to, because it's decentralized, we are ultimately the ones that are going to decide the direction of Bitcoin. We're the ones that are going to decide which parts of the ecosystem we're going to reject and which ones we're going to move forward with. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, he also brings up a couple of good examples. He goes after the one very particular core developer who was dumb enough to leave his keys on like a online server. He also goes about the mixing projects, Wasabi and Samurai. All of these points which he brings up, which I think adds to that point you brought up as well. It's either you're very broad in that spectrum and you realize, well, what this is potentially all about, or you go into these camps. And I think what was a bit missing for me in this article, and that was my criticism, he thinks it's only like one way. And I do believe at the end of the day, you do have multiple options. I just think in terms of adoption, we're not at the point yet where Bitcoin is big enough that you can form these camps. Yes, they are like the privacy guys and the NFT guys, they're the traders, the hodlers, all of these things. But if you put that into perspective, into like the traditional fiat system or the banks system, Bitcoin is still a very small asset. Even though it's already a huge world for us personally, there is still a lot of catching up to do. And I think the next biggest thing would be something like gold's market cap if we want to tackle this. And that's where I think it would become much more broadly accepted and much more used in terms of everyday people having some Bitcoin or thinking about buying some Bitcoin because they've read about X, Y, and Z. Having said that, though, he did set that up from the beginning. So he said what his visions were and what he wants to achieve, but he brings up a lot of points where I go, yeah, he's got a point. Like the whole mixing thing with the privacy thing, I think if you not go into the Bitcoin from the beginning, being very privacy cautious, you do run into some issues. Like you and I, we put our faces out now, we speak about these things. It's not hard for like, if there were a government crackdown and they want to find out who is talking about Bitcoin, they would see our faces. Like we would be pretty much attackable on that front. So I think, you can only get rid of this if you start as an anon and you stay anon all the time and you do everything right. Fair point. The whole core developer thing, I think is a very, big point he brings up where I agree immensely. Like just because someone works on Bitcoin code doesn't immediately make them more knowledgeable than other Bitcoin users. Yes, they work on the technology stack, but different experiences come together. And what I really liked about this part of the article is where do they get these people from? Talking about the one developer storing his keys on an online server. Well, these people are the ones inventing things like SegWit and Taproot that can't be criticized because they move Bitcoin forward. It has advanced so much that we can now store pictures of monkeys and audios of farts on the blockchain. good. That was sort of his arguments where I go, okay, the whole picture on blockchain thing, again, depends how you look at it. I'm not a big fan of it, but if people want to do this with them, who am I to tell them what to do? But I think the more important thing is there are certain inventions in the Bitcoin space which have significant improvements. Like SegWit is the reason we can use the Lightning Network, for example. Taproot, from my understanding, does have a lot of improvements in terms of privacy, not complete improvements that you get that you get in anonymity and all of these things, but it improves some forms of the protocol. It was a big upgrade. On the other side, it brought in the NFT stuff and all of these things. But he brings up a good point. There are a lot of valid criticism points in the Bitcoin landscape. And a lot of us like to say, we should be self-critical, but whenever you bring them up, there's a big discussion. And this is where I always start a bit doubting, well, is this a natural evolution, or is this like a narrative? Is it not okay to attack SegWit and Taproot? I mean, I like being able to use Taproot with certain wallets. I like being able to use my Lightning networks with SegWit. Thank God for that. But sometimes I also go like, well, it complicates things again. And is it really necessary? That particular thing that we can't question some of these things does seem a bit strange to me. And that's when my brain starts working. Is there someone out there pushing a certain narrative? Yeah.
And you have got influences in the space. You've got these well-known voices in the ecosystem, and with a big following, and they do have a lot of influence as to people's mindset and the direction that they see Bitcoin going in. Potentially something we need to just keep our eye on. We need to keep our eye on the ball and just slay your heroes, question them, and just sort of be critical of what they say, because they talk about the whole stacking sats thing and about hodling and holding on to your Bitcoin. And this person is arguing, well, if you don't use your Bitcoin, how can we create an ecosystem where this is going to be the new money in the world? And I get that and understand that. And I kind of agree with that, to be honest, because we need to start transacting in Bitcoin. But obviously the message, the mainstream message is, hodl, don't spend your Bitcoin. And, look, at the end of the day, it comes down to this whole, overused phrase, Bitcoin is for everyone, because it is, and it's going to go in the direction it goes in because the majority of people get behind that direction. So we are voting with our Bitcoin and our sats. And we're going to do with it what we're going to do with it. And if people are going to decide just to hold on to it indefinitely, that's down to them, right? And there are going to be plenty of people that are going to be using it to sort of buy coffee with, like you did the other day, Joël, and, be part of that ecosystem in that way. Look, Bitcoin's being adopted more and more. But over time, as more people get behind it, it's going to be harder to convince millions of people than it is hundreds of thousands. So we're at early stages. We're still early in Bitcoin. So it is clunky. It is going to be up and down, left, right. That speaks volumes as to the volatility of the Bitcoin price as well. People coming in, going out, not understanding it, being misguided or, not fully, you get the general sort of tone of what I'm trying to say. We're still early.
I think closing up, yes, it is a bit of a cliche to say Bitcoin is for everyone, but it truly is a fact. And if we don't embrace that fact, I think we're not better off than frankly other solutions, whether that be gold, stable coins, whatever it is. If we don't respect these critical questions as well, that's when we never evolve. And you brought up a very good point. When I paid for my coffee with Bitcoin, it's just as simple as asking these shops, can I still pay with Bitcoin? They say yes. It's mostly an instant conversation starter. The guy behind the counter immediately asked me, well, do you hodl or spend? And I told him both. I like to have a stack that I hodl, but I also like to spend and see how it works in the real world, talk to people like you. And in my opinion, that is a big part of Bitcoin's mission now. Is it exciting? Probably not. I know there are other crypto projects out there who offer like DeFi and NFTs and all of these things. But my main question is, well, does it have to be exciting? Do we have to create these special narratives to make it more sexier? Or can we just acknowledge that, it kind of feels like a grandma right now. And we kind of have to go by this fact, and maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, there are more applications being built on Bitcoin. And who knows, maybe it will never be a payment solution. You know, maybe Lightning is just like the fad right now, and eventually it dies out or it adopts more users. That's sort of the thing we have to keep in mind. And I think it's important to be self-critical and to, you know, always have that check-in. I like that comment from your end in the beginning. It's good to have a Bitcoin check-in once in a while.
It is, yeah. And I always try and remind myself that Bitcoin is decentralized. I've got a fantasy and ideology, and I like to think where Bitcoin might be going, because that's where I want it to go. But it might never get there because, you know, it's decentralized. The masses will decide where Bitcoin goes, and I just have to accept that as fact. You know, I can do my bit and say what I say and sort of contribute to this ecosystem like we're doing now with this podcast, and that may or may not have some sort of influence in the narrative and the direction of Bitcoin. I don't know. And at the end of the day, you know, it will just go where it goes, and the masses will decide. And that's what the whole idea of decentralization is for me. You know, if we start to sort of like all rally behind one narrative, then we just become a collective of, you know, we're replicating some sort of central ideology in some way. I think we should always continue to evolve and question what we've got and make the next step, you know, and we're never going to arrive at one place that's the perfect place for humanity, because the future is yet to sort of come, and we don't know what the future holds. So we just have to keep on moving forward in the direction and continue to have a narrative. And that's going to be forever changing, right?
That's actually a good point, because recently a friend of mine, we had a very long discussion after a football match, and we ended up, he also works in Bitcoin, so he has a lot of these same touch points, I guess, like we do. And he asked me, you know, it's always funny if I speak to other friends who then tell me, well, but what if Bitcoin doesn't work out? What are you going to do? And I sat there and sort of thought to myself, well, if that happens, there are still many aspects in Bitcoin I'm interested in that potentially could happen in other places. I've always been very tech and, you know, sort of people stories focused. So I bet I could find my avenue there somewhere. And, you know, for whatever magical reason, let's say Bitcoin does fail, which I don't believe, but we always have to come up with the worst case scenario. Maybe there's the decentralization aspect in Africa with funny stories to write about or to go and explore. Maybe I'll do this. Maybe AI will win and destroy us all, and I'll be able to work for an AI overload. They also need content to be written. You know, I think there's always something you take out of these experiences where you can, in the future, either adapt to a certain narrative again, finding certain stories, or you have learned certain skills which you can then use for other topics. Because I think life is much more exciting if you keep finding new avenues to excite yourselves rather than just spending your whole career talking about one topic for 50 years, or God forbid, do the same thing every day for 50 years. I think that's much more, that's a horrible scenario in my mind, rather than Bitcoin failing and I get to do something else. So, what about you, Ian? What are your two sets regarding this?
I just think that at the end of the day, just keep being critical, keep asking the questions, and we'll just keep on finding the answers. And there will be plenty more questions behind that. And that's the only thing that we can really do, is just remain focused and remain critical of each other and of the ecosystem and the world we live in, because I think we will eventually, you know, find a way to coexist. That's just where I am. Maybe that's just airy-fairy of me, or but I think over time we will need to converge to a place of understanding, and, you know, even then we will be moving in. I mean, I'm losing my train of thought again, but it's a complicated thing to explain, really. But I just think my two sats will be just keep asking the questions, keep being critical, and then that all we can do is really sort of move forward with that. That's it really. But feel free to cut all that out because
No, I like that. I like that. I think the overall sum up of this episode is trial and error. If we never try it, we'll never know. And it's up to us to do it now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That's 100% right.